Today's guest on Metaconscious Leaders is Anthea Roberts. Anthea is a globally recognized legal scholar, strategic thinker, systems innovator, and author. She's a professor at the Australian National University, a visiting professor at both Harvard and Columbia, and the creator of Dragonfly Thinking, an initiative combining structured analytic frameworks with generative AI to help leaders navigate complexity more clearly and more creatively. She's worked with governments, global institutions, and thought leaders on how to design for risk, resilience, and reward in a world of converging crises. But what perhaps is most striking about her work is how she invites, even challenges us to think differently. So welcome, Anthea, and thank you so much for putting time aside to be our guest today.
Well, thank you for having me.
What I'm really curious about is where and how metacognition, which is at the heart of your work, meets metaconsciousness and the nature of this interface and how the interplay. And when you first came upon my radar and I saw what you were doing, I thought, oh, this would be an interesting conversation. And not least because AI is a hot topic at the moment and is clearly having a profound impact on so many different things and the world and how we work in it. But we'll get to that. Perhaps where we could start, Anthea, is your backstory and how you came upon to be working in complexity thinking and how you came to find that that was quite natural for you. It was almost like your bag, your home.
Yeah.
Could you say something about that? Because I think that's a really interesting, it feeds into how you have arrived at what you're doing and your current path. And I think I saw you someplace talking about this as an early realization when you were at school even.
Well, I think when I was at school, probably the realization was that I was sort of comfortable in the humanities and social sciences and also comfortable in like the maths and sciences. So I'd always had that background. What I wasn't comfortable in was actually schooling environments. So I was a good student in terms of grades, and I was a very poor student in terms of attendance. But as I've gone on, I've become probably a better student over time as I've been able to become more self-directed. And I think as I went through university, I realized again that I was sort of interested in, I started off with maths and philosophy and with law. So sort of having this multidisciplinary background to begin with, but ultimately ended up doing law and international law. And I think as I started doing that, I realized that I was always very interested in different perspectives. So I think the reason I was drawn towards international law was I wanted to not just understand law within Australia, I wanted to understand law between different countries and different nationalities. I was drawn to travel and seeing cultural differences. And so this kind of idea of looking at different perspectives and different disciplines had always been kind of innate to who I was. But the particular thing that sort of took me to metacognition, which I didn't have a name for at the time, was that I realized that I was often not interested in answering or arguing about particular sides of debates. I was much more interested in mapping the way rational actors could actually understand situations very differently, have very different frameworks, very different values, and often not be able to really talk and understand each other. And so if I look back, I spent time in legal practice, and then when I went into the academy, all of my major pieces tend to change areas, but what they have in common is that they have a sort of a meta-awareness, not just of how I'm thinking, but how I think other groups within my field are thinking, and particularly where there is complexity, where there are controversies, where different groups have different perceptions. I'm often somebody who comes in and sort of takes it up one level and says, let's kind of see what's going on here. And so I started to realize I was doing that within international law and then across different national approaches to international law. So how do international law disputes look from China's perspective or from Russia's perspective or from French international lawyers or American international lawyers. But all of that sort of that interest in crossing borders and that interest in different perspectives really came to a head, I think, several years ago in the mid 2000s, when I started to think that my traditional discipline of law was not going to help me answer these questions. And that was because I was seeing rising US-China, great power rivalry. And I was thinking this was going to completely collide with economics and trade and investment and technology. And I sort of realized that all of what we'd taken for granted as the international regimes were going to be thrown up in the air. And that within my field of international law, that was just one perspective on it, but it wasn't going to be a perspective that was going to really rule the day. And that I needed to better understand economic approaches, security approaches, political science approaches, sociological approaches. And so that's what took me out of legal studies and into an interdisciplinary environment. And in the interdisciplinary environment, I got asked a lot kind of what my methodological basis was. And when I come from law, people either did legal interpretation or they did law and economics in very sort of quantitative ways. And neither of them had ever felt quite right to me. And I liked to look at the macro picture. I liked to look at how everything was interconnected. I didn't like to take really small, narrow issues and nail them. And so I didn't really know what my framework was. But by working in this interdisciplinary group, I started to become aware of complex systems. Reading about complex systems, it suddenly made sense to me that this has actually been the way that I had always understood problems of multiple actors, interconnected, competing in some ways, cooperating in some ways, different perspectives, different timescales. And I remember somebody who had done a lot of teaching of complex systems work said that often you would find that about a third of people would be like, oh, this is how I've always thought. I just didn't have language for it. And so I was in that category. About a third of people were like, I don't naturally think this way, but now you explain it, I can kind of get my head around it. And about a third of people just thought like it was rubbish and it made no sense and it just didn't work at all. And so I sort of realized I was in that first category where the complexity theory sort of made sense of my interest in everything, everywhere, all at once.
It's fascinating. I'm going to feed in with something else here in a moment. You did some really interesting, or you worked with somebody who'd done some interesting research with the CIA and about forecasters and experts not being very good at it.
Right.
Would you say something about that?
Yeah. So part of the work that I ended up doing for my last book was about the pushback against economic globalization. And we tried to understand it through 6 different narrative perspectives of everything from geoeconomic competition through to climate crisis, through to right-wing populism. And as we were trying to sort of articulate the nature of the project that we were doing, I came across the work by Philip Tetlock, who had done the work about super forecasters. And what I found really interesting about that work is that they found that when they were trying to work out who was best at understanding complex problems in order to forecast forward, and they were funded by the CIA to do this, they found that traditional experts tended to do very poorly because they tended to overemphasize one lens of analysis. And what they found is actually the people that did much better at forecasting, and in order to do better at forecasting, you really need to sort of understand a complex problem. What they had in common was that they saw the world through dragonfly eyes. And he used that metaphor because dragonflies actually have thousands of different lenses that they incorporate into an almost 360-degree view of reality. And they use that to project forward, and they're actually the best killers in the business going after their prey because they are able to fly to where it's going to go. And I started to realize that it's those 3 traits that really capture the methods that I'm interested in. So the first is that ability to take a complex problem and disaggregate it into many different lenses or many different perspectives, all of which reveal and all of which obscure. So you're taking on many different insights. Secondly, that sort of ability to integrate it into decision-making frameworks that aren't of any one of those frames, but are informed by all of them. But then the third is to start to think about how those decisions play out in complex systems over time. And that's where the complexity theory can really come in as well. And so I started to see that the work I was doing was really a type of work of the type that Philip Tetlock was talking about. And interestingly, this happened around the same time as I was presenting to many different governments, agencies. And one of the agencies that I was presenting to was our intelligence agencies. And they were like, you're creating structured analytic techniques. And I was like, I'm creating what? They were like, you're creating structured analytic techniques, which are ways that you sort of unpack and critically think about complex and ambiguous problems. So I didn't know what that was. I went home, bought 3 books and read these books about structured analytic techniques. And I was like, indeed, I create structured analytic techniques. And so the structured analytic techniques are ways the intelligence agencies try to teach their people to think and to de-bias so that they're able to see problems from many different perspectives and connect dots in various ways. So there's a really natural alliance between kind of my dragonfly thinking approach, the work of Philip Tetlock on forecasters, and then these structured analytic techniques which are used in intelligence analysis.
I find this very interesting, and it correlates very much with what I've heard from Ian McGilchrist. Are you familiar with him? And his master and his emissary.
Absolutely. I love that book. And so I think I've always found in the modern academy that it was very, very left hemisphere of like, let's kind of go narrow and stability and prove it and hold it. And I was naturally a right-brained person who was interested in essence and in interconnection and in the whole and in like sketching. And so his work really resonated with me about these two very, very different mindsets, and that you both need both of them. So not everyone needs to have both of them individually, but in society, we need to have both. But often the right-brained people can sort of understand the value of the left-brained in a way that the left-brained people often can't understand the value of the right-brained.
And
But I was
that's
also quite
crucial.
taken with his approach where he said that the kind of biases we're developing in our university and government sector and business sector is it's almost like we've had a right hemisphere lobotomy, because we're focusing so much on measuring the narrow and the quantified that we're missing the bigger picture, we're missing the bigger connections, and we're missing kind of the holism that's relevant. And many of our structural problems, I think, are coming from that now.
Yeah, I love the way he says that the left brain, because our brain, like all brains, I understand, are asymmetrical. And the left brain, its essential purpose, says Ian McGilchrist, is to get lunch. It's to it's to get the food. It's to apprehend something. It's to grasp it. It's to use it. It's to pick it apart. And it does that under instruction from the right brain, who has a more expansive, holistic view of what's going on, because its key role is to avoid being lunch or
Yes.
becoming someone else's lunch when the left brain is looking for lunch itself.
Yeah. Yes. No, I love that. And he has the thing about the two different eyes on the bird, one looking for the food and one looking to not be eaten. And so I would definitely characterize my work as being right hemisphere style of work, which often not just looks at the bigger picture, but actually paints the very canvas on which some of the more specific exacting work can be done once you have the conceptual categories framed. So it's
Yeah.
often pre-methods in a way. And I think a lot of our university approaches kind of skip that approach and assume you can just apply methods without actually applying these conceptual approaches first.
Left brain apprehending, right brain comprehending. Two words that seem to also sum that up quite well. Okay,
Yeah.
I'd like to look now, because you talk in your model about bringing in, or within your Dragonfly thinking, bringing in geoeconomics, geopolitics, the environment, security, bringing in those things. And my thought is, what happens if we bring in something else, something like consciousness? If we expand ourselves to looking at it from this point of view, and also thinking of this in terms of humanity and the global context which we're now in, which is one of meta-crisis. It's a polycrisis of immense complexity, in which even the survival of our species is often questioned. So how we think perhaps is no longer in itself sufficient. Maybe we need, as Einstein, or to paraphrase Einstein, as he inferred, to raise our conscious awareness and examine the who and the why, as well as the how. And this, I think, is a frontier for metaconscious leadership. The fusion of metacognition, the thinking about thought and how one organizes that, and metaconsciousness, becoming aware of the one that's thinking. And what is the purpose of all of this anyway? And in that context, using dragonfly thinking, especially with AI, purely for competitive advantage and to dominate one's particular market sector may seem a little short-sighted in the bigger picture. So I'm curious about how the power of dragonfly thinking powered with AI can have a different impact. In your model of structured analytic thinking of metacognition, how do you distinguish between thinking about thought and being aware of the thinker. What happens when thinking frameworks, if you like, meet consciousness frameworks, where metacognition meets metaconsciousness? Maybe you'd like me to say a little bit more about where I'm coming from, but
Well,
what's your
let me
initial?
start and then see how it connects with what you're saying. So, first of all,
Okay.
you're the first person that's ever asked me this. So, it's a really interesting question of how does metacognition intersect with metaconsciousness. It's also interesting because I'm very highly metacognitive, I'm not spiritual in the sense of I'm not a believer in God, so I'm not somebody who's been strongly religiously influenced. But one thing I notice is that almost invariably, when I meet people who really resonate with the type of work I do about complex interconnections and the way that I understand the world and my sort of interest in different perspectives and the kind of pluralism of that, and not just economic values, but non-economic values, and my interest in how everything is interconnected and how you want to think systemically and over time. Almost invariably, the people that lean into that the most often come from two different backgrounds. So one is that they often come from physics, which is interesting as a discipline because it is about how everything is connected. And it also does the multi-scalar from the tiny, tiny, tiny subparts of an atom to the universes as a whole, right? And so there's something very interesting about that approach. And I often find that the complex systems thinkers have a connection through to physics. The other group that I find almost invariably is Buddhists. So Buddhists seem to really resonate with my work. And it seems that a lot of the things I say about interconnection and systemic resilience and multiple perspectives and interconnections seem beautifully embodied in Buddhist thinking. And I would also say often East Asian thinking, some of the Pacific Melanesian styles of thinking, indigenous thinking, just not Western thinking. And so I think there's a really interesting connection there. I don't know if that resonates with you.
It does, because Western thinking, Western philosophy is very reductive. It's
Yes.
very narrow. It's very, we know it, as opposed to we don't know it, which is more holistic, more right brain, more open to diversity and recognizing our interconnectedness and our interdependence within our ecology. I think of there's doing, yeah, which is performing. Before the doing comes the thinking, which is kind of planning. And before the thinking comes the being, which is more to do with purpose. So who am I? What's my purpose? I need to think about this. I'm planning. I need to do something. This is action. So it's sort of purpose precedes planning, precedes performing. The meta, where awareness, which is holistic, begins to interface with action through thinking is very complex. And especially if we're coming at this from a Western reductive mindset, it becomes even more complex because we have to divvy everything up and define everything. Business is less of an understanding as definition. And that complexity is kind of where we get lost in the weeds, I think. And my thought is that Dragonfly Thinking, with AI especially, can help us overcome that beneficially if we have the wisdom to see it in the whole, as opposed to seeing it as a way of simply doubling down on concentration of power and wealth.
So it's interesting the way you say purpose through to thinking, through to action. I probably don't see it in quite such a linear way, but I definitely think that what motivates you as a purpose really affects what you think about, what you pay attention to, and what you do. And it's quite interesting. Dragonfly Thinking, I have a co-founder who's actually another professor at the ANU who's also my best friend. So I think the way you draw the linear between purpose and thinking and doing, I don't feel it quite as such a linear path, but I definitely think that when you have a different purpose, it changes what you think about and pay attention to, and it changes what you do. And I see that most clearly with my co-founder, Miranda Forsyth, who's another professor at the ANU and also my best friend. And it's really clear that we have many things in common. So we're very interested in multiple perspectives and pluralism of values and understandings. And we're very interested in complexity thinking. But she's fundamentally motivated by relationality and what relationships are like and making sure that relationships are good. And she's very motivated by a sense of justice, whereas I'm actually much more motivated by innovation and creativity and new discovery. And so we pay attention to different things, and sometimes these are in tension with each other, because sometimes in order to innovate, you need to be disruptive and you need to kind of do things that aren't comfortable within existing relationships. And Miranda would always be someone who would be very attentive to how that might upset somebody or how that they might not feel good and so not want to do it. Whereas I have this feeling of like, well, we need to pioneer and we need to discover. And if that means we need to shake things up, then we need to shake things up. And so we both, I think, have very kind of clear senses of purpose, but they make us focus on different things and do different things in various ways. So that's kind of the first angle. But the second angle that you've been asking about is AI. And I've found the experience in the last 2 years of dealing with AI and large language models to really raise some pretty profound questions for me about human cognition and how we think and how others think. And so one way I've been reflecting on that is that I've made an entire career and my whole life really about 2 levels of metacognition. So I think a lot about how I think, and I think a lot about how others think. And most of my scholarship and insights really come from shuttling back and forth between these 2 levels of metacognition. But suddenly about 2 years ago, when I started using large language models, there was this alien form of intelligence that I needed to start to understand. And so I realized that there was this third layer of metacognition of trying to understand this alien other and how it was thinking and how it was behaving. And then I realized that how it was thinking and how it was behaving was very, very strongly related to how I was interacting with it. And so that made me realize there was this sort of fourth level of metacognition of me learning how to direct the AI to do certain things and how to interact with it as like not just a director, but a coach and then an editor, and how to deal with AI output as it came back, which is often like a deluge. And so I realized I didn't just need the third layer of metacognition of how is the AI thinking. I needed the fourth layer of metacognition, which was how was I thinking with the AI? And then as I started to create tools for other people using AI, I realized actually I needed to have a fifth level of metacognition, which was not just me to the AI, but me to the AI to a third person who may be less aware of how AI works and less metacognitively aware. And how could I direct the AI, not just in how it interacted with me, but how it interacted with other people? And so it's really kind of expanded my thinking about thinking, and it's expanded it beyond the human form. And so I'm particularly interested in the type of thinking, not where AI can replace us, but where we can actually synergistically work with AI to do a kind of thinking that neither humans nor AI could do by themselves. And that sort of human plus AI cognition is really key to the tools and techniques we're developing at Dragonfly Thinking.
It's interesting because as you're talking there, you talk about metacognition. And at times, I figure that where you're talking about meta cognition, it's kind of blending with metaconsciousness. It's continuing elevating, or another way of looking at it is increasingly objective look at distinction from thinking there to being aware of the thinking, to being aware of different forms of thinking, and then to be going to another level and another level and another level. And it kind of gets back to where the Buddhists would be thinking in terms of what's it all about? Who am I? What is real and what is mere thought and mere action? And what's the drama that we're involved in, which is this sort of kaleidoscopic drama that we engage in. I'm not for a moment diminishing the importance of that or anything, but its real value comes in a higher perspective that brings in awareness of our interdependence, our interconnectedness with everything, because that enables us to move forward and avoid some of the collisions that happen when we're simply down in the weeds, not understanding what the big picture is. So
Right.
I can understand why the Buddhists, for instance, like your work, because they probably sense what I'm sensing, which is that you may be talking about metacognition, but at some level, you're also blending with metaconsciousness.
No, that would make a lot of sense. And if you look at some of the specific frameworks that we developed through Dragonfly Thinking, some of them really clearly link with some of those traditions, not deliberately, but just they overlap with them. So one of our frameworks, which is on that second stage, so first stage is multiple perspectives. So they could be different disciplinary perspectives or economic, security, environment, or different countries, but different ways of seeing the world. And then you try to integrate them into these frameworks to think about it in the round. And one of the ones that we do is this risk, reward, and resilience framing. And one reason we do it is that often people have a tendency to focus on minimizing risks or on maximizing rewards. And people often struggle to hold the tension between the two. And you can think of particular individuals who very much are on one side of that. You can think of particular disciplines and particular departments that are very focused on one. And they're often not thinking kind of holistically about like all of the company's benefit or all of the national interest. And so the first reason we do the risk, reward, and resilience is to hold that tension between minimizing risk and maximizing reward. But we add a third element, which is resilience, because a lot of the times in our Western approaches, we focus on particular risk reward decisions about particular actions and particular points in time, but we don't think enough about systemic effect over time. And it turns out the resilience category captures a lot of that systemic effect over time. And so the way we think about resilience is we have three parts to it. So we have absorptive capacity, adaptive capacity, and transformative capacity. So absorptive capacity is your ability to sort of your system, you individually, your company, the globe, the ability to sort of take a shock and not suffer harm from it. And so you could not suffer harm, for example, if you have a run on PPE, but you have stockpiles of PPE, or if you're running late for an appointment, but you have a buffer in your diary. So there are all sorts of ways that you can absorb. But one of the really important ways that we absorb is actually through our relationships and our social capital and our social cohesion and the strength of our interconnectedness. And that's often been eroded by some of the ways that we've prioritized our economic relations. You also see it in terms of things that economists would call externalities and environmental externalities, where you've faced particular risk reward, but you've actually built up problems in your environment over time to a point where you're sort of breaching your absorptive capacity and the system as a whole is problematic. So I think there are a lot of connections there with absorptive capacity. And then adaptive capacity is really your ability to make small changes and adjust and adapt and keep going in response to various things. So if you think about in COVID, for example, that would be retooling manufacturing or bringing classes online or work online. But the third type of resilience is actually transformative resilience. And a lot of people don't think of transformative resilience as resilience because in Western culture, we often think of resilience as bouncing back to the status quo. But sometimes the status quo itself is not resilient. And so a lot of the problems we're having in our societies and in our economy and in our globe at the moment are because we've actually put ourselves on a pathway that's not resilient. And so if we actually want to be resilient as societies, as individuals, as a globe, we actually need to fundamentally transform our economies. And so something like the clean energy transition is an example of that, where you're not trying to bounce back, you're actually trying to bounce forward to a structurally different and incentive-wise different system that has a new resonance level that's at a more stable state than we are at the moment. And I think all of those ideas about absorptive capacity, about adaptation, and about transformation, I think work really well with a lot of the sort of meta-consciousness that you're talking about.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what you've been describing there as well is very much what's been happening environmentally also. So if we think
Absolutely.
about the absorption of heat into the oceans and our absorptive capacity has now been filled, we've now got to adapt. But actually adaptation in itself is not sufficient. We do need to transform and rethink everything.
Right. And so interestingly, I often give exactly this example, but I also then link it back to risk and reward in two different ways. So the first way is that if you're always minimizing risk, you actually undermine your resilience over time, which creates risk for you later. So if you don't get any exposure to pathogens, then you don't build up your immune system and you get more risk. But interestingly, on the flip side, if you always maximize short-term rewards, you also undermine your resilience and you undermine your future rewards. So we know out of business innovation literature that if you're always maximizing for the dollar today, you tend to not build up enough diversity and adaptive capacity and invest in R&D and breakthrough technologies. So you're more likely to be disrupted for the innovation of the future. So there's a clear kind of relationship there between risk and reward and resilience. But interestingly, there's also kind of a way of thinking about resilience as being connected to those two. So one of the examples I give of this is if you think about all of the fights that are happening at the moment about who makes semiconductors and electric vehicles and whether it's China or Europe or the US, part of that is a response to the climate crisis and the need to reduce the risk from extreme weather events and climate change. But part of it is about positioning for future awards of who's going to have the capability and who's going to have access to which markets for the opportunities of tomorrow's economy. And so you really start to see resilience as not just a way of, because people often put risk and resilience together. Risk, reward, and resilience. Resilience is actually interplays between now and future, between individual, isolated, and systemic, but also between risk and reward, not just as a response to risk.
So this is where transformation comes in, I think, perhaps, and where adaptation, the things that you've been talking about there, and creating alternative sources of energy, use of more efficient technologies, etc., collides with the old paradigm of got to apprehend it, make a profit, dominate, etc., etc. Which brings me on to a question which I have for you, which is the extent to which Dragonfly Thinking with the AI could perhaps help us to forge a new paradigm in which cooperation is balanced more with competition. I think both of them have their place. Early on in a technology, for instance, there's a lot of cooperation. There's a lot of people working together as knowledge is being brought together from disparate sources, whether it's universities and companies and so forth. But then when it becomes established, it tends to become siloed. It tends to become concentration of power and wealth in that particular sector. And complexity is another area where cooperation becomes more and more important. And yet cooperation can be complex in itself. It's like, well, how can we work out a win-win situation for everyone? Well, that's a very tricky thing to do. I'm just wondering whether Dragonfly Thinking with the AI, whether these sorts of models can actually help us with that thinking element when we're trying to get to a place where we can survive together on this planet, which is physically limited in its resources.
Yeah. So really, really interesting. I've got two responses to that. So one of the ways I like to think about this competition versus cooperation is that you often have both things going on, but sometimes you have both things going on at different levels within the system. And there's this really nice diagram by Yanir Bayam in his complexity book, where he gives the example of people playing sports. And so if you can imagine, you and I are both rugby players. You and I are competing against each other in order to get onto the rugby team. But then if we both get onto the rugby team, you and I are cooperating with each other against another rugby team that we're competing against. But that other rugby team and our rugby team are both kind of cooperating to get sort of market share and attention away from hockey or from swimming. So on all these different levels, you can be competing on one level and cooperating on the next, and competing on that level and cooperating on the next. And it sort of depends on which level you're looking at and how you're focusing your span of attention to work out whether or not you're focused on the competitive or the cooperative, and they're all playing all at the same time. So that's the first aspect of this. The second aspect of this, Well, how does Dragonfly Thinking help with this? Yes, so interestingly, Philip Tetlock and his co-authors, Sudfeld, I think it was, they actually studied leaders that were high or low in integrative complexity. So if you're low in integrative complexity, you tend to look at things, situations from one perspective in much more black and white ways. So us versus them, right versus wrong. And you can be a very strong champion of your approach, but it can be hard to understand or have any sympathy for, empathy for an adversary's approach, for example. Whereas people who are high in integrative complexity are able to see a problem from many different sides. So that's the kind of like, how do you disaggregate into the different lenses and the different perspectives? But they're also able to then synthesize it back together to find ways that you might have new overlaps or alliances. And what they actually find is that leaders that are low in integrative complexity are much more likely to lead their countries into violent wartime situations and conflicts. Whereas leaders that are high in integrative complexity are much more likely to be able to find peaceful solutions, because even if they don't fully agree with the other side, they can kind of see where the other side is coming from, see through their eyes, and they're more likely to be able to find negotiated solutions that find some new overlap between their interest and the other side's interest by sort of looking from different perspectives and reframing in various ways. And so I think there is really something in that dragonfly thinking approach. And part of what we try to do is get people to look at, for example, different stakeholder perspectives. So you could imagine being in an investment bank and not just thinking about like shareholder value or like company profits, but also thinking through kind of what do community stakeholders think, what do like people who are ESG advocates think, what do regulators think, really try to sort of see it from many different eyes and then understand how different solutions may be in favor of multiple groups or may be strongly in favor of one group but against another group. And that often if you get into those situations, what looks like a win for you in the short term builds up resentment or anxiety in a way that can undermine your wins in the long term. So I think many of these aspects where you're trying to think from many different perspectives, where you're trying to synthesize new solutions that take into account these multiple perspectives, but also where you think over time, not just about am I winning economically now in the short term on this particular project, but you're thinking relationally over time, systemically over time, like what is the impact for social cohesion? What is the impact for my social license? What is the impact on the environment? What is the impact on our political system? All of these things that you take for granted in order to make your profit. It sort of changes your perspective of what is a win.
Really, really super interesting and very, very pleasing to hear as well, Anthea, because we need a helping hand in this regard. AI guardrails, if we can move on to those. It's kind of guardrails normally get put in when something goes wrong. There's an accident and somebody says, perhaps we need a guardrail here. It was probably always apparent that one would be needed. And it may well be with we go through the same process there, where it's only when something collapses that we try and put in guardrails. But perhaps that could be too late. And I do feel that with AI, things are developing so rapidly. If we are unable to find a way of governing or managing AI in a way that serves the whole, in a way that serves a common purpose, then it will be used or could be used by bad actors to increase concentrations of power and dominance. And that would not be a good outcome. And also, in a very practical sense, I was struck by a statistic I heard the other day, which was that Ireland has 80 data centers, which consume 20% of the national electric power output. The power required to fund, to power AI is humongous and becoming huge. Another statistic I heard is that by 2030, the amount of power consumed by AI would be equivalent to Japan. So we're talking about a huge environmental consequence of AI at the same time as the conversation which we're having now, which is how it could benefit us.
Mm.
And so again, we end up with this balancing act of, well, how can we, that's an unintended consequence. How do we bring that into the equation?
Right. And then there are other unintended consequences as well. So, for example, the need for more power has actually now re-enlivened the debates about nuclear energy, and it could well be that the nuclear energy is not just about powering the data centers, but it's also something that could be helpful for us dealing with climate change. And so, the interconnections across many of these areas are difficult to play out, and it's hard to know what's going to be positive and what's going to be negative. And I think we're going to be taken by surprise by a lot of this. Well, interestingly, so my position at the university, I'm a professor of regulation and global governance. So everybody always wants to ask me about AI guardrails. But I've got a slightly different view on this, at least with respect to the large language models, because the actual models are developing very fast. But social adoption of this, particularly enterprises and governments, has so far been pretty slow. And I actually find that people are really not embracing these technologies to even understand them enough to have strong debates about like how to use them and what's good and what's bad. And I actually see a lot of people talking about AI who don't really use AI, and they've got a lot of concerns about environmental effects or bias or lack of transparency. But actually, they don't have any real lived experience of how to use the technologies and how to benefit from them, and also how to counter some of these issues about bias, for example. And so, my feeling is actually at the moment, instead of regulating strongly now, we actually need to sort of understand and play with some of this technology more before we even really have a sense of what its impact could be, and that there will be negative things that come up, and we sort of need to adapt as we go, as we start to observe those negative things. So the level of sycophancy that we see in the models now, I think, is something that people are starting to clock and needing to adapt to. But I see many governments at the moment being so scared and so focused on existential risk and so focused on guardrails that they have no lived experience of what this could be or the possibilities. And many of the people who are really concerned to critique that it could like reinforce economic inequalities, um, then don't also talk about the fact that it could provide medical services to people that don't have access to doctors, or it could provide amazing tutoring to people around the world that don't have access to amazing tutoring. So I just see it not as a black or white thing, that there are going to be many, many positive and negative effects, and many things that look positive in the short term that become negative in the long term, and vice versa. But my experience at the moment is actually that we are underplaying with this technology, and we are under sort of understanding what we could do with it that could be positive, partly because we're scared. And I think people are scared because they're scared about, second order effects and externalities. But I think they're also scared about like, will they be replaced? And I think that fear is creating a lot of negative reaction to AI. And that the people who are often the most negative about AI are the ones that don't use it at all. And often people, when they do actually use it, start to see some really positive aspects of it.
Hmm. Well, I must say that a personal admission here, I'm one who's coming over from the Luddite quarter towards AI as I use it more. But that doesn't blind me to what I can see as being the downsides, even already. I'm concerned, for instance, that some people seem to be delegating so much to AI. It's almost like AI is beginning to make decisions for people that I know who are using it. They're asking AI for its opinion on XYZ, like a personal relationship, and are acting on the basis that, well, AI told me that this was the best thing to do. So when we get to the point that we delegate to AI because it's more intelligent than I am, it can make my decisions. That's quite a dangerous place to be, where we're we're becoming we're putting ourselves in servitude to it rather than using it as a tool that benefits us.
So I believe very strongly in the human AI collaboration rather than the automation and the delegation. I definitely think the automation and delegation will happen and is a risk. But interestingly, I think people again often split on this. So one way to think about this is when we used to all work in fields and walk, people didn't need to go to the gym. And then when like we started to have cars and you didn't have to work in fields anymore, some people became couch potatoes and some people became gym bunnies, right? And so you could imagine the same thing happening cognitively, that some people become cognitive couch potatoes and some people will become cognitively gym bunnies. And one of the things I find interesting about the debates about, outsourcing your critical thinking is I'm 100% sure that there are going to be people who do that. There's just no doubt that that's the case. I can also say from my own experience with AI that I'm using it to cognitively stretch myself to do things that I could not do by myself. And for the first time in my life, I'm experiencing cognitive strain in a way that just I haven't experienced before because of the level of interaction I'm able to have about so many topics and such vastness and the speed of the interactions and how many interactions I can have on this. Um, and so I'm definitely like in the cognitive gym bunny uh, group. Um, but you can absolutely see that people are going to go both ways on this. There's also last week, there was a really interesting article in the New York Times about a therapist who used ChatGPT as a therapy buddy and how it wasn't a therapist, but their interactions were therapeutic to the therapist. And the therapist realizing that it wasn't the AI, it was their co-created relationship and what emerged from that. And so that kind of synergistic back and forth is very much what I'm interested in. And that person also really reflected on how they were able to get ideas from the AI that they didn't have that were really wonderful. But there were also times when the AI was sycophantic or did make things up and the person had to like pull the AI back in line and say, no, don't do that, or that's wrong. And so this kind of constant sort of movement up and down of I'm in the discussion, but I'm also kind of watching and policing the discussion that I think we're going to need to have with AI. And this is a sort of new set of skills that many of us don't have yet. And even those of us who have it don't really have language around yet.
It almost circles back to Ian McGilchrist for me in The Master and His Emissary. If AI is the emissary, we're the master, the AI is the emissary. If we start to perceive, if we give too much to the emissary, then we might lose ourselves in that and lose the bigger picture and come not to be a gym bunny, but actually be a couch potato. And my thought there also is not that goes further, which is if culturally, if societally we fall into that, we're effectively falling into a situation where bad actors can leverage their power and ownership of AI systems to dominate and shape society in their interest.
Yeah. So one of the things I think is interesting about this is you frame it as we're the right brain and AI is the left brain. But one of the things that's super fascinating about the large language models is their right brain abilities. And so one of the reasons that I think I'm so drawn to them is that whereas humans often find it hard to understand diverse perspectives or look at things from diverse angles, the models are incredible at it. And a lot of people don't think they're incredible at it because if you just ask a simple question, it will give you the median answer. But if you push it to adopt a security perspective or an economic perspective or a perspective from someone coming from this country or this culture, it can actually give a much more realistic rendering of that perspective and talk between the perspectives than humans can. And we also see this in some research we're doing at the moment about models and language use, that many of the models that we deal with in the West have a bias in their training data where they tend to be predominantly based on Western English speaking and often US materials. And so if you ask them a question, they give answers that are quite Western English speaking and US. And so they have a sort of a cultural bias. But that's if you ask them just a standard question like, how should I do parenting? They would probably default to a standard American answer. But if you say, oh, but actually I'm French and I'm married to this person from Japan, how should I think about parenting? They'll give you totally different answer based on those cues. And we're also finding in our research that if you ask the question in different languages, then they will sort of culturally fit themselves more within that cue about how that issue is discussed within those languages. So even if the majority is a sort of homogenizing Western bias in some of these models. There's actually extraordinary latent cultural knowledge baked into these models if you know how to access it. And so they're some of the techniques that I'm super interested in, and I don't think have enough focus on at the moment, because everyone often stops at like, well, there's bias. And I'm like, well, yeah, there's bias, but like, where is there opportunity? How can we interact with the systems to get other things out of them? And if you can do that through prompts, it gives you an openness to see things that you couldn't have traditionally seen through typical media consumption, for example.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that pushback, by the way, on my metaphor. Metaphors have their limitations, and I completely agree with what you just said there. You know what, Anthea? There's so much, not only that we haven't covered in this conversation, but I think there's so much that's arising all the time that I would love to do this again with you, and you know, perhaps focus in on slightly different angles or aspects in the future. So I hope that would be possible. In the meantime, very aware of the time. Thank you for your time. And is there anything that you would like to say in closing, particularly to business leaders who are facing complexity, and where and how they can link up with you with Dragonfly Thinking and the work that you're doing?
Sure. So we speak to not just government and policy makers and intelligence analysts, but we speak to business leaders a lot on these issues. And there actually wouldn't be a business leader out there who doesn't understand the problem of trying to not just think about economics and shareholder value, but also think about, societal, like social license or environmental issues or geopolitical issues. And so people are very aware that we have these different things that are colliding in the polycrisis, but no one really knows what to do with it. And I would say that actually some of these sorts of tools and techniques are really helpful ways of helping you to systematize and understand and navigate these complexities. So please do reach out to us. You can find me on dragonflythinking.net. You've got a lot of information about our approach, lots of newsletters and videos. But it's something that we're really interested in seeing how we could create AI tools that help people deal with this complexity, but also allow them to take an approach that privileges systemic resilience, because I think that's going to be something that's increasingly important as we deal with the polycrisis in the next era.
Anthea, thank you so much for being our guest today. Many thanks, and look forward to being in contact again in the future.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Be well.
Great.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. And if you did, please follow us, like us, and share with friends and colleagues. And also leave a comment, because it's really useful to know what you're thinking about as well. Until next week, thank you for listening and watching. Be well.